IVM.
Podcasts are a modern new medium for most of us in India, but is the underlying technology stuck in the 2000s? Can we reimagine podcasts as a potentially more interactive medium in 2020, a time when media is being generated and consumed with incredible dynamism? Kartik Parija of Adori Labs joins me both to tell us and show us how. This is a special experimental episode of the Pragati Podcast that goes beyond the audio and the conversation. Dear listeners, I would request all of you to try and listen to our episode today on the IVM Podcast App, the Adori iOS app, or your desktop or mobile browser to get a richer experience that includes images, links, polls, and more. You can download the IVM Podcast app at ivm.today/Android, the Adori iOS app at tinyurl.com/Adori app, and listen in on your browser from tinyurl.com/Pragati142. You can find these links in the episode description as well. In case you cannot do this right now, that's perfectly alright. You can listen to this and all future episodes on your current podcast app and you will have the same experience as always. You can switch later for a richer interactive experience. Welcome to the Pragati Podcast, a weekly talk show on public policy, economics, and international relations. We take a step back from noisy political debates and dive into rich conversations on India and the world. I am your host, Pavan Srinath. We'll start this episode's conversation after a short break.
Hey everybody, welcome to another great week on the IVM Podcast Network. If you're not following us on social media, please do. We're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. I'd like to thank our sponsors this week, Paytm Money and Intel. Really fun week, and I think that you guys should definitely check out some of the stuff we did. So we had Shifa Mehta, who is the host of the show Smile India, on the Paperback Podcast. Really fun thing. On Edges and Sledges, our hosts had an episode just amongst themselves. No guests this time. Really fun show with lots of cool banter. I think you'll enjoy that quite a bit. On Storytellers and Storysellers, Vineet had Shrishti Bell on. Shrishti is the head of Netflix in India, and I think you'll really enjoy that conversation as well. Also, do check out Uncle Please Sit. Joel and Tushar had Anuya Chatakar on. Anuya hosts the popular YouTube channel Books on Toast. And don't forget others of your old favorites like The Habit Coach, Football Should Ball, All Things Policy. All of them are doing a great job during this pandemic, and you should definitely check them out. And with that, let's get you back to your show.
Hi, and welcome to this rather special episode of the Pragati Podcast that's both a little meta and quite experimental. Kartik Parija, the co-founder of Adori Labs, joins me on this episode to tell us about how podcasting technology can be brought to the 2020s. Welcome, Kartik.
Thank you, Pavan. So happy to be here.
So, Kartik, let's get the obvious conflict of interest out of the way, shall we? So now, IVM Podcast is one of your customers. IVM works with Adori Labs, and the Pragati Podcast, Teleharte, and many other podcasts are hosted on Adori's servers. And beyond just hosting, Adori also powers the new possibilities that we are trying to unlock in this particular episode as well today.
Yes, it is. And thank you for calling that out. We're really excited to work with this entire extended IVM family.
Thank you. And so this has been in the works for a while. So for this episode and for the future of Pragati, we haven't really traded any favors. Nothing else has happened, but we're really excited to be doing this together. I mean, we think of podcasts as modern, especially in India, because they're quite new. I don't even know if they've come of age yet, but they've become more and more popular every year over the last 3-4 years. But at the same time, the technology that sort of lies behind podcasting is significantly older, even if quite young compared to mediums like radio. Dear listeners, in the introduction, I had requested all of you to try listening to this episode on the IVM Podcast Android app, the Adori iOS app, or on your browsers, be it your mobile browser or your desktop browser, using the thinkpragati.com link. If you did make this shift, do key in your answer to our first in-episode poll for the day. Yes, now with the interactivity that Adori offers, we can do polls, I can share some images, we can share some links that don't necessarily distract from the audio experience, but can enrich it for those of you who are actively listening and also watching your screens. I just want to get a sense from all of you listeners, How are you listening to this episode right now? Have you shifted to a browser? Have you shifted to the IVM Android app or the Adori iOS app? Or do you usually listen on your browser and do you usually listen on the IVM app? Right? And I'll share these results on the next episode. And I think together we can discover a little more about how all of you listen to the Pragati podcast, and we can do this together. So Kartik, I got into podcasting not that long ago, 3.5 years ago. I have been an active podcast listener for probably not more than 5 years. I've been quite late to the game. But could you take us back perhaps 2 decades and talk to us about some of the technology that enabled audio on demand and eventually what was called podcasts?
Sure. Thank you again for this opportunity, Pavan. And given that we're using this interactive format, I'll try to also send you some links to share with your audiences about where they can read more about what is essentially a fascinating history of how audio went from, really a broadcast radio sort of history. Of course, music took it to a lot more device-driven with CDs and cassettes and all of that. But storytelling, whether it's speech or narratives that came from individual creators, I think really benefited, like everything else, from the explosion of democratized distribution on the internet. The way this was done before podcasting was, the sexy new medium that we are all discovering these days. I have been a podcast listener a little bit longer than you have, just because I think I had a distinct advantage of being a graduate school computer science student in the US when a lot of this experimenting was being done to extend what is essentially the web, whether it's HTML or the graphical layer that came up in sort of the mid-90s, and then being able to sort of distribute information as quickly and scalably as possible, driven a lot by news organization. News is something that's thousands of years old, right? We find different mechanisms of putting out news. And so as the internet came into news, you can go as far back as Gopher and Usenets and discussion boards and all kinds of things. But when HTML, XML specifications started getting hardened a bit and more mature by the 90s, essentially, I think it was Ben Hammersley at The Guardian, or is he at the BBC? I can't remember. I'm sure I can add a link to his illustrious career. Really came up with this word podcast. And then, it was Dave Weiner, who was one of the authors of one of the RSS specs. And I'll say what is RSS. It's essentially really simple syndication or rich site summary. Depends on whom you ask and what they think about the acronym. But it's essentially a standard that websites, especially news, used to offer sort of a feed of content, right? This word feed was very new 25 years ago or even 20 years ago. We are talking about sort of the year 2000.
And the word podcasting that you mentioned, that only starts by around 2004 or so, right?
Yeah, 2002, 2003, this word was probably coined, and I think it became part of this RSS mechanism, or borrowed from the RSS mechanism to be distributed around 2003, 2004. So your dates are correct.
And so therefore the technology, the feed that is being served by this RSS predates that word by a few years.
Yes. And I think that's an interesting point, the word feed, right? I mean, today we are used to so many social media feeds and we just are comfortable with this word. But it wasn't so. And feed was probably a lot more driven by folks who actually had a feed to give you, but couldn't burden you with the vocabulary of what that meant. So all of that kind of stayed under the hood with this standard called RSS, so that people could pull essentially a feed of information. It could have articles of text. Imagine a newsroom trying to get you the latest news through what is an internet-like interface, through a browser or something else. But there was no clever way to send notifications or alert you that there is a brand new thing happening or some bell icon ringing in the corner on your phones. There was no such thing 20 years ago. So this feed, if you had subscribed to this feed, and this required a very specific action, which is, as you know, you have subscribers of your podcasts, that word has carried on saying, I'm expressing an intent to be notified when I have something new from this particular trusted publisher.
So RSS in that sense was the original push notification on
Correct.
The internet.
That's a very, very, rudimentary. I'm sure the creators of RSS who went through, a lot of them worked at Netscape in the mid-90s and they did an incredible amount of work. But this is probably a small summary and not doing justice to the entire standard. But yes, very important and a nice way to capture it.
Because it's not just a notification, right? Push is actually the full information as well.
Correct.
And I think for many of us who are listening, and for me personally, RSS feeds became a thing when I started looking at blogging.
Yes.
Because I would want a feed from my blog, which was basically rich text of some form, maybe with a few images. And I wanted to be able to read that on Google Reader, which in college days was the best place to go read and discover things on the internet. RSS has always been linked to blogging for me. Was the innovation there that you could also do audio along with just rich text and other things?
I'm probably going to anger a few nitpicking historians when I'll just say yes to that question.
You can say no as well.
Well, it's always a bit more nuanced. But essentially, if I want to sort of summarize this, an MP3 file, which is sort of a binary representation of an audio recording, was packaged to be able to fit into an RSS feed. Like you said, the RSS feed is not just a notification that something is available, but the entire package of what was available was also there. So in a way, the binary or the MP3 file was just massaged to be saying, hey, you are a package. RSS allows me to essentially put the whole thing out there. So I'm going to have this link in it that says, provide this MP3, and it just essentially instigates a download on the other side, because the other side is saying, well, I don't quite know what to do here. I can't be super intelligent with MIME types and tell you there's a play button. All that happened eventually. But essentially just pushed this MP3 file. And because audio is not video, it's much smaller, much leaner, highly compressed in this particular format, it actually fit quite nicely with this, what I would call a very interesting hack of using RSS and HTML to be able to deliver audio files. And as you can see, the natural extension this is why the word downloads, which is so loaded in the podcasting world, also happened just because of the hack that was done to implement it.
Wow. And so this hack on an existing technology, which was one of the first of its kind to be able to push information to people who have opted in, has resulted in the birth of a mini industry, if you will.
Yeah.
And now a not so mini industry.
Approaching $1 billion, a year type of industry, especially led by, I would call it the corporatization of podcasting in the US. And I think the US went through, I would say, 4 sort of distinct cycles of podcasting hype. One as soon as it was done, but that remained in this small, tiny group. And then possibly sometime in the 2007s, 8s, then sometimes, maybe closer to the 11s and 12s. And of course, then serial happened about 5 years ago, which is when you identified yourself also coincidentally of becoming a podcasting listener. I think a lot of the, let's call it mainstream, non-geeky, I know what an RSS feed is, I know what a opt-in is, I know what a subscription is. They just had interfaces and devices now, though thanks to Apple, who did this with the iPod 15 years back. Actually, now it became a default app. People started clicking on it, figuring out there was a simple way to hit play and listen to stories. That's where the mainstreaming and the sort of big explosion has happened. And I think other than just the commercial part of it, of trying to make a new media more mainstream there's actually just genuinely been amazing storytelling that's happening from here. Without just anybody's story can be heard. And I think there's just such a beauty in that whole concept.
Absolutely. And so therefore, this technology that enabled it predates the iPod itself, right?
Yes,
but
it does.
Perhaps the iPod and the ability to now serve this piece of audio on this dedicated listening device, which also started transforming how people listen to music and how digital that was. So that got linked in, right? So perhaps the Apple connection and the Apple heaviness, even now on the Pragati podcast, even in a country where most of us own Android phones, I can say that on the Pragati podcast, the single largest number of people might be listening to it on Apple Podcasts or iTunes or elsewhere. It's, of course, far below 50%, but that perhaps is a reflection of how strongly Apple, the iPods and iPhones have been connected to the podcasting ecosystem, right? From 2004-05 all the way until now.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think kudos to Apple for doing that. They actually moved pretty quickly. I mean, if you date this hack of being able to sort of put audio into what was essentially a textual feed structure called the RSS, if you say that happened, I think it was 2003, 2004. By 2005, Apple sort of, adopted this and essentially gave it a very large megaphone, pun intended. It said, listen, I will accept this whole downloads concept. I have a device which is essentially built for offline listening, which was geared towards music. And I think there was just, they really had an eye on the future when what Spotify is doing with saying we are not just music, we're an audio app, listen to whatever you want here, podcasts and audio. In a way, the iPod did the on-demand version of it 15 years ago. They said speech audio coming from user-generated content, an alternative to talk radio or narratives, and plus the music that you will buy through iTunes. Remember, all of this is pre-iPhone. Right. And a lot of our listeners today are listening to it, as you mentioned. And, again, quick little shout out that IVM has plans to even have an iOS version to make sure that its most engaged community have options to listen to its network. And in the meantime, of course, the Adori iOS podcast app is a place where this can also be heard in an interactive manner.
In that sense, Google has been a fairly late mover, right? And I feel that frustration as a podcast creator, because while most people own Android devices in India, I think Google had its own native podcast app launch, in 2018, 2019? Even since then, the billing has been quite limited. It's interesting to see this contrast. Perhaps some of this can be explained by how the United States had a rich history of talk radio. So moving from talk radio to on-demand audio made sense for a company which also focuses heavily on the United States as well, Apple.
You're right. But I think, I struggle with this just pure sort of American only. I mean, yes, I agree with you. They have a history. And also, I think the Americans have just been very, very good at adopting new media options. And you also have a very vibrant sort of individual creator space, whether it's independent musicians or the advent of blogging and all of that obviously made this push possible from just a demographic behavior around creators. But if you look at it, actually, audio-rich geographies are across the world. India is just an amazing audio storyteller for thousands of years, I would argue. Everywhere there was a broad, large state broadcaster, such as All India Radio or the Australian Broadcasting Corporation or the British Broadcasting Corporation. I think just tended to bring a lot of talent out. They were trained in places where audio narrative storytelling was a way of life. I think as those creators had all the way from interns to producers, this entire talent pool, when they went independent, or if they did, or if they realized that they could, just went and explored these things. And, as usual, technology both follows and leads, right? So you follow a certain behavior and say, can I make it easier? And Adori is sort of in that game where we are interested in creator empowerment and giving them the tools to sort of do whatever they need to do. Technology also leads by saying, okay, I can do all of these things. And then the cyclic behavior starts where creators look at it and say, oh, wow, this technology allows me to do this. And I'm going to use it in very surprising ways or new ways. And, that's a beautiful, beautiful space to be in. I think you're raising an interesting point about why this happened. But I also know that it has taken almost 20 years for podcasting to become a relatively significant way of consuming content.
I was just looking up a few statistics before our recording, and as of 2018, we had, I think, about 500,000 or 525,000 shows that were listed on Apple Podcasts, which is a good proxy for how many podcasts are out there. About 18 or 20 million episodes that were out, and now in 2020, that has doubled to 1 million active shows and overall about 30 million episodes, right? So that's significant number, and of course there'll be a long tail in that distribution, a long tail in that listening. Big podcasts out of the US, out of NPR and others still sort of dominate the landscape. They might be 200 independent creators in India, but even among Indians, perhaps more people will listen to just NPR's Planet Money than perhaps all the others combined. So we are in a very interesting space. Perhaps we'll get back to the technology, but can you tell me a little bit about how you have seen the listening evolve over these 20 years?
I think it was all browser for the longest amount of time. There were no smartphones, and I would say the
Browser and iPod, right?
Yeah, so iPod, I would say browser first and then iPod. But even while the iPod was, selling millions and millions of devices, I would still argue that at least between even 2005 and 10, or the first, let's say 2.5 years after the iPod, before the iPhone came out, I think there was obviously a big listening push on the iPod, but the browser remained a very significant piece of listening, because you had the first generation of adopters, listeners who said, okay, I know what an opt-in is, I know what RSS is, I've heard about this. You had these amazing folks like Adam Carolla, who really pushed this format through the browser, then available on the iPod. But I think the next big push came in when, after some maturity of iPhone, I can't remember which iPhone generation, maybe I'll attach a link to it, which made the podcasting app, which really took the entire iPod podcasting piece, which was related to a piece of hardware and behavior, to becoming what is today just another app. But to make it default is another step, to have it default installed on the iPhone, where people would be like, okay, I opened this phone, I bought this with a lot of money, and now I look at this icon that says podcasts. What does that mean? And I think that's really where a lot of the curiosity driven, who have no sense of the history of RSS and really frankly shouldn't care, they're just looking for entertainment, education, information, whatever it is. And they pressed it and they were like, I would still argue that they're being greeted by a screen that is really difficult to navigate, and the whole issue of discovery, curation, personalization, we can spend time on. But it had a push there. And I think I'll connect it back to your earlier point about Google being a late entrant in this piece, because they have generally been very good at indexing all sorts of information, and they've done really well on text, obviously their 22-year history, and now obviously video through YouTube. But audio is something that I don't think they spent as much time on. They had approached it possibly from a commercial opportunity around ads and things like that, which is their bread and butter. But I think kudos to Apple again for making this a default experience, allowing curiosity-based discovery, all of that. I think obviously mobile listening, especially through app-based listening, has been very high. Though I will say that especially in the last 3 or 4 months, we are seeing people who have lesser commutes or lesser outdoor activity. They're going back to their, browsers a little bit, desktop-based listening and things like that. But from a listening experience point of view, just to your question, frankly, I think this is where we've not been very respectful or on top of the sort of sheer younger digital native audiences that have come on here. Remember, we talked about all this history and it's 20 years old. I have teenagers. They don't really have a sense of that. For them, it's default. So I think they are used to very, very new types of experiences around their video, music, text, social media type links. And we can debate whether audio should be, or podcasting specifically, should remain this sort of lean back passive listening, which you do only in commutes, or do you explore a lot more other possibilities where we are exploring an interactive version of this podcast here. I think that kind of new experiences are going to become front and center. They will be related to things like monetization, towards engagement, towards analytics. But fundamentally, I think it's also about enhancing the story.
I fully agree, Kartik. And in fact, I want to take this opportunity to just ask our listeners if they don't mind keying in their preference on a small poll, because I really want to understand how people might listen to the Pragati podcast and other podcasts, right? Do you listen when you're occupied with a second task? That could be working out at the gym, you're commuting, you're doing something else. Is that the primary mode? Or do you listen to podcasts dedicatedly? You, again, may not be interacting with your device, but the only thing you might be doing at that point is listening. Versus you're actively on your device while listening and don't mind occasionally interacting with it as well, right? I really want to know, because I myself am a bit of an outlier listener, I think, because I have never had structured commutes where I had the opportunity or the privilege to listen to something while driving. For me, podcast listening has always been very different. And what I've discovered over time is people do listen to podcasts very, very differently. Like for someone who might primarily be watching video, the idea of binging audio might sound odd, but I've seen so many people, and I've seen myself do this as well. I'm going on a flight or something, I will download 10 episodes of my favorite podcast and then listen to all of them while on that flight, right? So I'm binging there. It's fascinating how all people might listen, but unfortunately, the tech, or not just the tech, just the medium itself feels so static and ancient, right? It's this one-line piece of audio that is of a certain length. The only innovation I see is that now you can play it at multiple speeds. That's pretty much it, right? And you can do it on demand rather than listening to audio where it'll play at its designated time. How do you think about that at Adori, Kartik? How do you go beyond these minimal innovations on this audio format?
Thank you. I think we spend a lot of time at Adori thinking about this. It has been a labor of love to explore what the possibilities are. And I think there are two distinct things that we have to keep into account. And in our avatar as engineers and technologists and people who can build product, the why nots are things that just, are challenges. They're like, oh, who said you can't do this? Who said you can't do that? And it just becomes about grappling physics and math, code and things like that. But in the larger scheme of things, that's actually a smaller part of the problem. So you can actually, invent a way to insert actionable multimedia elements into the audio signal. And we can do things to make sure that they are all backward compatible. And when I say that, I mean the audio should work normally in any type of device like Apple and Spotify, like people are listening to this podcast right now. It's the same exact interactive podcast that is playing in their non-interactive players. But if they were to listen to the exact same file being played in the IVM app or the Adori iOS app or the Pragati website link that you've sent out, there is a special player that's been embedded in it that allows this creator enhancement or embellishment to come alive and allow for all that to happen. But that's all sort of the engineering implementation of this. The 70% of the problem is really about adoption, being able to respect all the things that you talked about. Like Pavan in a plane is very different from Pavan on his scooter, is very different from Pavan in a gym, is very different from Pavan at home, from a context of listening or consumption, right? It's also about the kind of content. Are you listening to something purely for entertainment? Are you listening to, and let's broaden this beyond podcasts. Let's talk about news, sports, music, things that have repeat value, things that don't. Daily news podcasts are not really heard more than once. You don't read yesterday's newspaper, even if you haven't read it before. But there are some evergreen pieces of content in there, which is op-eds and coverage of certain players that you like, that, are timeless for you, but maybe not timeless for others. So this complexity of layering, especially when it comes to context, is very, very hard to capture in an engineering manner. This is something that is driven by community. It's driven by ideas. It's driven by just simple requests. Like you as a creator are requesting your current listeners to try something new. And that's really going back to the heart of almost any experiment. Going back to RSS and MP3, we are back there. We are back there to say, how does this get, a little bit more broad-based? And I think sometimes it's just pure ability to be kind to the kind of person who's taking the effort to saying, I'll support, the curiosity factor to say, I'll explore, and just being made to realize that there is something better out there or there is something different out there. And it is up to you to decide, whether that's good or bad for you. And I think that just changes constantly.
Certainly, because for me, it's a privilege and an honor that people are deigning to give me not just half an hour, but often an hour of their time every week to tune into these episodes. The idea is, am I delivering value? Can I deliver a value better? Can I make this a more meaningful experience? And just one example, and this is something we've been discussing before our recording as well. The idea that we are talking about something, you mentioned Dave Weiner a while ago, we mentioned various things. Now, many listeners, they might be curious about learning more, but the idea is to either hit pause or remember that I mentioned Dave Weiner and then try to look that up online later. And then there is so much friction in even exploration and expansion of that curiosity, right? For the subset of people who are curious and want to learn more. Not everyone wants to, but the idea is that in text online, we have made that far simpler. I'm sure it can even be improved, but you just have a hyperlink and you can click on that when you want. And now on a browser, you can open that in a new tab so that you can look at that later. Now, we all know that there's a problem when you have 60 open tabs, which you're never going to read, but you still have that option, right? And that makes it richer. You can ignore it if you want, but you have that ability. And what's saddening is that the option often doesn't exist when it comes to podcasts.
That is such an excellent, you're just describing, I think, far better than even I am. My trouble has been that why is the default lean back and passive if the world has moved on to having devices and surfaces that allow you to lean forward, or what we call lean back and forth. And again, you might choose to lean back and forth at home when you're actively listening to an educational podcast that needs you to assess yourself and submit answers. You have Netflix that's exploring interactive video content where I remember reading Hardy Boys in I don't know when, which allowed me to say, go to page 76 if you want to see this, or 71 if you want to see that. And, that was 30, 35 years ago. Netflix is doing that today. The question is, why can't it just the default, as it say, the option that the expectation is if I want to lean forward, I can have it. And you can, in that option, you can still choose to go back to default lean back behavior where you're doing this in the car or things like that. And so it can moving the binary to be yes versus no. And then I think working on a combination of both adoption, respect of user behavior, onboarding, and technology to be able to say even things that are gray can happen. Like, for example, I might have a highly interactive podcast or piece of audio I'm listening to, but I'm driving right now. Obviously, you don't want to be looking at screens and doing things like that. But could you have a voice interface that says, hey, bookmark this for later, or remind me when I'm done, or share this 30-second clip with my wife because that's really interesting? Because that's what the micro moment is. It is micro, it's ephemeral, it goes away. And all your points about hunt, search, recall after 50 minutes of listening to this just may not be possible. Frankly, a very poor interface. And as I talk to, again, younger audiences, my kids being pseudo product managers in a way, is that they are like, listen, if you want me to do something, make it simple for me, make it happen now, give me the option to fulfill it, or forever hold your peace. Don't sit and now lament that, oh, I did all of this, but you're not coming back to it. And podcasts, especially, as I said, I think there is, of course, evergreen content, but there is also stuff where it's not a music file, which is your favorite song from the 90s that you will play 500 times. It doesn't have that kind of repeat value. So you really want to capture the engagement and the enhanced storytelling on first, second, or third listen.
Absolutely. And Kartik, let's take a quick break here and we'll come back. I want to ask you a little more about the industry, about various other parts of the podcasting ecosystem that can also be brought to the 2020s in a way that the medium can also benefit and creators and others can benefit.
Sure.
Do you wish you were smarter? Well, so do we. But the next best thing?
We could make you sound smarter.
And to help you with this endeavor, we are Simplified, a podcast that attempts to break down the complex world around you with a little knowledge, a lot of poor jokes, and a ton of random trivia.
Episodes out every Monday
On the IVM Podcast App or wherever you get your podcasts.
See ya!
Hi, I'm Pavan Srinath and welcome back to the Pragati Podcast. I'm here with Kartik Parija from Adori Labs, and we're talking about how we can make podcasts interactive and really bring them to the 2020s, right? I mean, we are in a world where very, very new, exciting things are happening with video, with new media and so on. But podcasting still seems to be stuck somewhere with technology that's from quite a few years ago. So Kartik, I want to start by asking, but could you give me a sense of what the podcasting as an industry is today? What kind of revenues are people seeing? And of course, this is perhaps heavily US-centric, but give us a real picture of talk radio and podcasting as an industry.
Oh, sure. Again, there are probably people who understand this and know a lot more than I do, but I'll take a shot at it. You're right. A lot of these, I should say, commercial metrics about mainstreaming, and a lot of the time that means money, is very US-centric, which is possibly the most mature geography for this medium. And I'll be very honest that Adori is based in the US, and I happen to live in India with some of the members of our team. And so we are just very thrilled to be able to have a customer in IVM who's really, I think, been very futuristic about what they want to do. And kudos to Amit Doshi and his team. I think this was estimated to be about $1 billion by next year, reaching that number by the end of the year. Most of it driven by advertising, which is audio advertising that has been inserted into popular podcasts, either at the beginning, usually it's a product placement by a brand that has a call out where the host is reading out a link that they can go get an offer from, 20% off. And the internet has automated ad systems probably better than anybody else. Google, Facebook, Amazon are all making billions of dollars on this automated ad systems. So it's natural that people have built programmatic and dynamically inserted ad systems that are not host-read anymore, but they just find a marker in the audio, and as long as this permission's been gotten, when you as a listener hit play, the audio file is repackaged to suddenly contain ads and then served to you. You can have things like personalization and geolocation and all of this sort of sophisticated. I would say sophisticated from an engineering point of view. It's unclear whether it's good from a listening experience point of view. Generally, the question is, do you like ads? The answer is overwhelmingly no. But I think in podcasting, listeners are very aware that they're getting a free experience with incredible value, hopefully, and creators need to find a way to support themselves. So I think that has sort of added up to being somewhere between $500 million and $1 billion, which in the grand scheme of things is actually a very small part of the entire audio market, if you may, which is still led by traditional broadcast radio around the world. Depending again on estimate, it's somewhere between $35 to $50 billion. And all of that is also pure advertising. It's a radio station saying, I'll interrupt your music every few songs, play you an ad, and so on and so forth. And that industry is very mature, 50 years, direct ad sales, agencies, and all of that. And then you have music, which has gone through its own, which in a way from a format point of view is the granddaddy or the big 800-pound gorilla in all of audio, which is very passion-driven. And there is a whole music business. It used to be analog and radio, CD, cassette, and sort of buying digital files, which has now moved to a streaming aggregation model where you get a subscription to a Spotify and enjoy all the music in the world in one place. But that's, I think also amounting to be another $10-15 billion. If you add news, sports, and all the sort of tangents to that come towards audio, some education is coming in now, especially with more online education. We're probably talking about $100 billion industry worldwide from a medium point of view, where audio is the primary medium.
But out of that, podcasts are just 1% then.
Yes, it's still very small, but from a hype cycle, New Yorker cartoon level, capturing imagination, it's possibly one of the fastest growing new medium formats in the world. It's sort of where blogging was, maybe 20 years ago, but still very small. And I think that if you really want to be able to support better storytelling, there has to be a monetization angle, the ability to be able to measure audiences better. All of the things that sort of have given success to, say, the YouTubes, the Netflixes, the blogging platforms, which are essentially the visual cousins of this medium, right? Video, text, and image, Instagram. I think people can argue about, oh my God, you're going to, sell out and it's going to ruin the experience. But quite honestly, podcasting, I just want to say Adori is an audio-focused company. Podcasting is just a method of distribution. It's something that our creators can do, our customers can package in, but they could also choose to leave them behind a paywall. They could choose to make this exclusive content available only on their website. They could allow this to be just a pure subscription model. They could have snippets of it coming out as blogs and videos and Instagram feeds. So that's really not the point. But if you look at a content value chain from sort of history of time, you've had these players involved, right? Between the creator and the consumer, regardless of format or medium. It's about the reader-writer problem. You have people who tell their stories and you have people who listen to stories or watch stories or read stories. And in between them have come the mechanics and the logistics and the technology that sort of allow this to happen at scale, from the printing press to the advent of cinematic experiences to radio becoming the sort of, radio in a way is precedes the internet in terms of delivering content at scale. I could argue that there are probably still more radios than smartphones in the world. And the UX is pretty simple. You turn it on and a story is playing or music is playing. The UX hasn't really changed, but it's pretty interesting. In fact, its fun fact here is that if you look at Adori, the name, if it's an anagram of the word radio. And, it's our way of paying respect to something that even preceded the scale of the internet, especially around audio. The people that came in between, the agents that managed the creator talent, the labels or the publishers or the rights holders who came in to help put some sort of discipline around how things get to market. The platforms and the distribution or the broadcasters, depending on which age we are talking, are the ones who actually control that last eye or ear of the audience. They are in the middle and they make and break talent. They have had a huge amount of power and influence in who gets heard and who gets watched and all of that. And I think the internet, just like how Uber and Airbnb sort of broke existing power equations and established new ones, in the content value chain, you've seen user-generated content go nuts on YouTube. And you've seen talent being discovered and be given independent platforms and things like that. But audio, led by music, which has had all this history of copyright and labels and things like that, I'm not saying good or bad, I'm just saying this is what it is, has been very lopsided in terms of providing the creator enough support, whether it's monetary or analytics or reach, to be able to really respect the purity of the connection between the creator and the listener. There is also the brand and the sponsor, the traditional advertiser that had sort of supported the cost of being able to get this story from a creator to a consumer. And so in this entire value chain, I think Adori is sort of trying to make sure that we can address some of these needs from each of them.
So then, Kartik, my question is, so one of the challenges we see with podcasts is that it is still this subscriber-driven model, right? I mean, subscriber doesn't mean paying subscriber, but somebody who has followed this 8-step plan of find a podcast, discover what podcasting is, download a podcast app, then search for the same podcast. Within that app, hit subscribe, then go to the episode that they like, hit download, and then start listening, right? So it's this chain that is filled with friction. And one of the other things that you can't do is, like on YouTube, you're listening to one episode. If you want, you can just go listen to another episode from a suggested recommendation, right? You don't necessarily need to follow a channel to get that content, and discoverability is far more organic. So in that sense, do you think podcasts are missing a YouTube moment? Like if you had that one player to rule them all, one service which captured a majority of the market, do you think that would have benefited podcasting? Is that what's missing?
Oof, that is such a difficult, loaded question, and I think
I know.
the answer in today's episode is quite subject to change. The next time we chat, but. Let me try. I think this is possibly one of the most important questions in the future of not just podcasting, audio, but even I think just across all mediums, where I think there is a whole movement of aggregation that really centralized all of this. Yeah, sure, you should have this magic all-in-one app that solves all needs, but you and I both know that's utopian. Just fundamentally, I don't think can even exist, just because the ultimate user is a human being, and a human being's concept of utopia is very different today versus tomorrow. And there are just too many moving pieces to capture. Some people will get really good at it. You can throw money at the problem. You can throw brute force at the problem. You can just put a social angle and stickiness to the problem. And there have been several networks, WhatsApp being a very good example of just saying, why aren't you there? This is the country club that everybody wants to be part of. But I think that fundamentally, this is possibly at odds of what used to be the niche fan following behavior, where in the end, and Kevin Kelly's wonderful 1,000 true fans and Legion recently made it 100 true fans just because of the power of the internet. You started off by saying subscription model without the payment. This is this is the worst kind of everything for the creator. You have this 8-step process to just discover you. You're hoping that you will be discovered. And then there's all this friction to get you to be a subscriber. And it seems like, wow, that's so cool. That's what we've gotten to. But then they're like, okay, how do I support myself if I want to do this? So I think that there is a big movement where creators, publishers, people who sort of really own and operate or control the content actually existing are now really trying to find out where their most loyal, engaged audiences are. And right now, they are lumped together with everybody else, the casual listener, the passive listener, the hobby listener, the one-off listener. And that's great. Everybody has a user journey, a listening journey, saying, I started off as a casual listener, but then I've become a diehard fan of somebody. And that might take a year. That might take 10 episodes. I just think that being able to identify it and respect that particularly heightened sense of loyalty is going to become a very key movement in the future. And we are starting to see this in the US, including, venture capital, and the term is called passion economy or new media model economies. And these are words that have been used by different thought leaders, where around an influencer or a topic of interest, you're essentially taking a very diverse but very loyal, engaged audience. Well, let's call it the business class of an airplane. I use this analogy. It's not a very good one, but commercially speaking, 10% of the seats may be business class, but they produce 70% of a flight journey's profit. I'm trying to make a point about how there is a journey where it was supposed to stop at this magic all-in app, whether it's Spotify or Apple or whoever else or YouTube. But I think there is a lot of community being built where you're now taking that aggregated audience, finding out what sliver of that 1,000 true fans are, and you're bringing them over to your, let's call it, surface or platform, whether it's the Pragati website or the IVM app or wherever else, where there is a potentially, let's call it, business class experience where all that loyalty, all that fandom is truly respected. And whether that means interactive experiences, whether that means exclusive content, whether it means getting access early, being able to support the creator through patronage, discussion forums, Discord servers, whatever you want to call it, if there is a way to sort of engage that without the aggregated app has this pressure to be in billions of phones and billions of services, and they need large numbers and all of that. You don't. The true fandom doesn't have to be very large, because you know that that's where the real purity of this creator-consumer relationship has been put in. But I think there is a movement that is going to happen.
Right. My takeaways here, if we still have this large intermediary in the manner of a platform, and we are sort of living in this era of platform economics, right, where you have Uber, you have YouTube, you have all these giant platforms that are two-sided markets that are connecting listeners, watchers, consumers with people who are creating, people who are producing. And there are challenges when platforms get too much power. Going back to YouTube, where a lot of independent creators have also seen immense success, especially in the last few years, it's become very evident that they are at the mercy of the algorithms that are there on the platform. To go back to this subscriber thing, with podcasts, we now live and die by people who have clicked follow or subscribe and are at least getting notifications of new episodes, if not auto downloads. Now, if a platform decides that, follow is no longer good enough, but that they will serve content in the manner that they see fit, then that completely changes things, right? And that's one of the things that happened with YouTube over the last 5 years. Even if you're following a particular YouTuber, if you just haven't listened to or watched something from that YouTube channel for, a few weeks, then if they drop a new video, that may not appear on your feed or that may not appear high enough. And so you have now become mercy to the platform, its family-friendly orientation, its frequency preference, and all of that. And that sort of takes away your creative freedom of being able to do what you want, but still be connected with people who want to watch and follow what you do.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think you're hitting the nail on its head. Like, we're all subject to algorithms, and this has been both a blessing and a curse in terms of fake news and what gets amplified and just any of that. And I think that you're right. A lot of the platforms, remember, there's an alignment of interest question, right? And all these players that we just laid out on a content value chain, they just have different things that they want, and it's based on how they're set up. I mean, you can't blame a business for focusing on what is most important for them. And if there is a large platform around podcasting or audio or content or anything, their alignment of interest is to be able to own the final user or the data related to the user. They are going to obviously choose that over what drives the creator or what drives the agent or whatever it is. And I think that it's important to understand and make sure that all sides are benefiting, and there are options where people should be able to step out and not feel so locked in, or even go to a different walled garden or a different lock-in if needed, because it satisfies some desire or some intent that is needed or necessary at that time. At Adori, we think of all of these alignments of interest and potentially conflicting a little bit, but one thing that is really stays the same is the signal, the actual story hasn't changed. Like, it is the same file that was decided to become a podcast. It moved from the creator to getting uploaded into a directory, which got indexed by a bunch of podcatchers, which then, went out to the listeners. Each of them might want different things from that story, whether it's money, fame, influence, entertainment, information, whatever it is, but the signal stayed the same. And I think the signal is actually in the control of the creator and the publisher. In this case, Pragati/IVM are the ones who are bringing this out. And I think in any system that we design for the future, making sure that you're not a very significant stakeholder in how that is decided versus being subject to the vagaries of an algorithm, I don't think we have all the answers.
I can see even Apple Podcasts or perhaps Spotify and others having ambitions which are perhaps in that direction. You want to be this one platform where you can listen to music, to audio, to podcasts, to everything. And that's a perfectly legitimate ambition. But at the same time, then, just for our mental anchoring, is what we are missing in podcasts the Wordpress of podcasting, right? Now, WordPress is this openware type system where you can, of course, have your own site on WordPress.com, but at the same time, you're just getting this sort of package. You're getting the CMS where you can build something that is entirely your own. It's an independent website. It can work as well as it does. And you're enabled by this infrastructure that's easy to use and access and build. Is that what perhaps we are missing or that we need in the podcasting space alongside the Spotify's and the Apple Podcasts and everyone else?
You could not have, I think, said it better. Adori is deeply inspired by this idea of WordPress for audio, or we even say Shopify for audio, or Stripe for audio. Just people who are willing to work with the creators. And when you say we, Pavan, it's important that the we suddenly shifted to being you as the creator. That was clearly Pavan, the podcaster, saying that, and not necessarily anybody else on the value chain, right? But I think there was a sense from the metaphor of WordPress, there was a sense of being able to, let's say, shape the narrative a lot more without losing what I call your brand. Because, you are a listing on YouTube, you are one of the millions on Spotify, you are one of the, hundreds of millions on something else. But if you have your own website, let's say, which is called pavansrinath.com, and it's powered by WordPress, I think the relationship is WordPress is saying, I am a tool, I'm a platform that allows you to still essentially take my tools, but white label, I will remain a white label or under the hood solution, where I'm not interested in saying, you need to come to WordPress.com and then discover Pavan. Pavansrinath.com is powered by WordPress, and it can do whatever you need it to do, whether it's audience reach or monetization, or, whether it's social media integration or figuring out integrations with third-party services, whatever it is, it's under your brand because that's what your audience resonates with. If you look at Shopify, a company based in Canada, which is essentially an e-commerce enabler, it just allows, say, you and me to start a merchandise shop. We want to sort of start whether digital or physical goods. It says, I want to start an online store. And Shopify, unlike, say, the Amazons of the world, would say, here is all the tools you need to own and operate a storefront. But you're going to pay a fee to get access to those tools. But we are not interested here in being a player between the brand that is you or the store that is you and your potential or current buyers. And I think, yes, I've been making this point and I talked about the passion economy. This is being actually actively tested by several, I'd say, creators and publishers, possibly in the beginning by people who have a little bit of a following, who have already established some credibility around the content that they have delivered. They are saying, let's actually take a little bit more control of this. And this idea of connecting creator to content to community building to actual commerce to be able to do more of what they do without trying to get PhDs in every single bit of it, whether it's tooling and technology and blah, 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 and relying on sort of the Shopifys of the world or the WordPresses of the world or the whoever else of the world. I think Adori clearly aspires to be a participant because we think it's directly related to creator empowerment. Most podcasters I know, Pavan, I mean, you have a technical background. You're not fazed by the fact that RSS is a standard. And frankly, everybody's a storyteller. Aren't they fighting enough with Audacity and Hindenburg and editing and removing ums and ahs and getting all of that done for that episode 3 final.mp3? Now they have to say, okay, now our only strategy is hope that we will be discovered by an algorithm on Apple or Spotify. I mean, they're going to do everything they need to do. They put out audiograms, they go out and post on YouTube, they have WhatsApp groups that go and put this out, they post it on Twitter, come listen to me. I think, just being able to connect all of those organically, whether it's reach, monetization, analytics, and distribution, I think we need the WordPress of audio. And Adori aspires to be that, hopefully a little bit easier than WordPress. I mean, WordPress is itself quite complicated. So
thank you for saying that. And for me, over the last 3 years, trying to record and produce, bring out so many podcast episodes, it's been a fantastic journey because I get like one-on-one masterclasses on various topics every week for free, and I get to make a living out of it, and I'm quite privileged in that. But at the same time, having done this at least for a little bit of time, I want to try new things, and there is, of course, innovation that can be there in the storytelling format, in the conversation format, and so on. But I'm really curious about how we can do this better, where along with this static audio or recorded audio, there are more ways in which people can interact with it, more takeaways, more meaningful things. And perhaps with this episode and with the coming episodes, I really want to see what else we can do. And I'm really looking forward to feedback from our listeners on how they think it's working, what they would like to see. Maybe it can be possible within the next few weeks. Maybe it'll take us a few months to get there. Put the email ID in the end. There's podcast@thinkpragati.com, where we're always welcoming emails. You can also message me on Twitter. And now there are a few things like the polls. You can hit a like and you can check out the links within the podcast with our interactive web players and the IVM Adori apps, where I think we can start getting some feedback and getting a sense of what else we can do with this medium. So Kartik, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me about this journey. Every 50, 70 episodes or so, I like to do a little bit of navel gazing in the podcasting space. Amit Doshi had indulged me a while ago to talk about how he thinks about podcasting and talk radio and why talk radio has been missing in India. And I'm glad you took the time today to talk to me about the tech behind podcasting and how we can reimagine this ecosystem, this value chain, and more.
No, thank you so much for having me. And absolute shout out to Amit Doshi. I know we established our conflicts of interest, right? But I just want to say very specifically that we have been focused so much on the US market. It's a real pleasure for us to be able to work in India, where some of us are from, and to have a customer next door to us, and possibly the oldest mover in this space in India, and somebody who's taken real risk without even knowing any form of reward at the very end. I think IVM has done an amazing job to put a creator collective together to really push this medium in India. And frankly, India, like every other country, will leapfrog this like crazy. I also want to say that all these bigger players and platforms, these are very smart people. They might have slightly differing alignments of interest, but they are not sitting still. You have these amazing ideas that are coming out of them, which are enhancing experiences. I want to particularly talk about Spotify Storyline, which gives you behind the scenes direct artist fan connect features, kind of like an Instagram story. You have TikTok Reso, which is a music app, I think currently only available in India and Indonesia, that are just taking the concept of album art and making it a user-generated graphic with beautiful animated GIFs on a mobile. I mean, these things seem small, gimmicky. They are not. They actually, in 10 years, this become absolute default, and people will be asking, where are the augmented reality experiences coming from audio? How do I see something with my smart glasses? I mean, this is science fiction today, but Asimov has told us very clearly that the foundation, again pun intended, is always a sort of soothsayer into the future.
Kartik, very eloquent words to end on. Thank you so much for joining me on the Pragati Podcast. Dear listeners, do let us know what you thought about the episode.
Thank you so much, Pavan. Thank you.
Thank you for staying with us till the end. If you have any questions or comments, do write in to podcast@thinkpragati.com.
And hey, if you like the podcast and listen to us on iTunes or Apple Podcasts, please leave us a rating and a review. It'll mean a lot to us. The Pragati Podcast is available on the IVM Podcast App and pretty much every other podcast app and platform. We are there everywhere.
Filter coffee is a fascinating beverage. You need to pick the right beans, blend them in the right proportion, roast them to perfection, and slow brew at the right temperature to get the perfect cup. Which is exactly like great conversations as well. You need to track down the most interesting minds, get them into their zone, and settle down for an unhurried, unscripted chat. And coffee for me is always, always, always best enjoyed with friends. I'm Kartik Nagarajan, and do share my table as I meet some of the most interesting people I know and sit them down for a strong cup of coffee and an even stronger conversation. Join me every Wednesday for a freshly brewed episode. This is not frappe. This is the Filter Coffee Podcast.
नमस्ते, मैं हूँ सौरभ चंद्रा
और मैं प्रणय कोटस्थाने।
जब महफिल खत्म होते होते दरवाजे के बाहर पुलिया के ऊपर हम दुनिया भर की जटिल समस्याओं को सॉल्व करने में लग जाते हैं तो हो जाती है पुलियाबाजी।
अब आजकल के अपार्टमेंट वालों ने तो कभी पुलिया देखी नहीं होगी, पर आप फीलिंग तो समझ ही सकते हैं।
तो आइए शामिल हो जाइए हमारी पुलियाबाजी में, जहाँ प्रणय और मैं एक से एक इंटरेस्टिंग टॉपिक्स की तह तक जाएंगे।
आर्टिफिशियल इंटेलिजेंस, बिटकॉइन, पाकिस्तान, मेडिकल एजुकेशन, करेंसी क्राइसिस, कभी हम दोनों के साथ और अक्सर स्पेशल एक्सपर्ट गेस्ट की कंपनी में।
सुनिए हमें IVM की वेबसाइट, ऐप या अपने फेवरेट पॉडकास्टिंग प्लेटफॉर्म पर हर दूसरे हफ्ते।